The courthouse stood tall against the darkening sky as Judge Wilson gathered his papers, wrapping up another long day of cases. The old building had become like a second home to him over the past 20 years. Its worn marble steps and echoing halls had witnessed countless moments of justice being served, lives being changed, and history being made. As one of the most respected circuit court judges in Atlanta, he had earned his reputation the hard way. Growing up in a modest neighborhood on the city's south side, he'd worked his way through law school, spending late nights studying while holding down 2 jobs. That determination had carried him all the way to the bench, where he'd become known for his thoughtful decisions and unwavering commitment to fairness. That September evening was unusually warm, the kind of night where the Georgia humidity hung thick in the air even after sunset. The judge's chambers were quiet except for the gentle hum of the aging air conditioning unit and the shuffle of papers as he reviewed his final cases for the day. A family custody matter and 2 property disputes, routine cases, but each one representing real people with real lives hanging in the balance. Looking at his watch, he realized it was already past 8 p.m. His wife had texted earlier about saving him a plate from dinner, and the thought of home brought a tired smile to his face. 2 decades on the bench hadn't made the emotional weight of decisions any lighter, but they had taught him the importance of balancing dedication to justice with taking care of himself. The parking lot was nearly empty when he finally stepped out, his footsteps echoing across the concrete. A few security guards nodded respectfully as he passed. They'd seen him burning the midnight oil plenty of times before. His black sedan sat alone under a flickering streetlight, a quiet testament to another day served in the pursuit of justice. As he settled into the driver's seat, the judge loosened his bow tie, a small tradition he'd maintained throughout his career. His mother had taught him to always dress with dignity, and even now, at 58, he honored that lesson. The tie was a subtle reminder of where he'd come from and what he represented to his community. The radio played softly as he pulled out onto the street, NPR's evening news providing a gentle backdrop to his thoughts. He was looking forward to the weekend. His grandson's first basketball game was coming up, and he promised to be there. These simple moments with family had become even more precious as his career had advanced. The streets were relatively quiet, with only the occasional car passing by. This was his favorite time to drive home, when the city was settling down and he could reflect on the day's proceedings. Streetlights cast long shadows across the road as he made his way through familiar neighborhoods, past the local diner where he sometimes grabbed lunch, past the park where he took his morning walks when time allowed. He stopped at a red light and noticed a patrol car in his rearview mirror. It was a common sight in this part of town, and he thought nothing of it. After all, he'd worked alongside law enforcement for decades, building bridges between the justice system and the community. The light turned green, and he continued his journey, completely unaware that in just a few minutes, his life was about to change dramatically. The night air was still warm as he turned onto Hampton Street, the same route he'd taken thousands of times before. His thoughts had already drifted to tomorrow's docket and the complex cases awaiting his attention. But fate had different plans for this evening. Plans that would not only change his life, but would eventually transform an entire community's understanding of justice, prejudice, and the power of unexpected choices. Little did he know that this routine drive home would become anything but routine. The next few minutes would test everything he believed about justice, challenge his deepest convictions, and ultimately lead to one of the most remarkable stories of transformation in recent memory. But for now, he was simply a respected judge heading home after a long day's work, looking forward to his wife's cooking and a quiet evening at home. The red and blue lights suddenly filled Judge Wilson's rearview mirror, their harsh glow breaking through the peaceful evening. He checked his speedometer. He'd been going exactly the speed limit. With decades of experience both in law and in life, he knew exactly what to do. Carefully, he turned on his indicator and pulled over to the side of the road, making sure to position his car where the street light could illuminate the entire scene. Taking a deep breath, he placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. The judge had given countless talks to young people about interactions with law enforcement, always emphasizing the importance of staying calm and following proper procedures. Now, he found himself mentally reviewing those same guidelines. Officer Sullivan approached the car with his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The judge noticed how the officer's hand rested near his holster, a detail that made his heart beat a little faster despite his years of experience in the justice system. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his tone notably harsh for what should have been a routine traffic stop. "Good evening, officer," the judge replied calmly, maintaining his professional demeanor. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" He kept his movements slow and deliberate as he reached for his wallet, making sure to narrate his actions. "I'm reaching for my identification now." "You ran that stop sign back there," Officer Sullivan stated firmly, though there hadn't been a stop sign for the last mile of the judge's drive. The judge knew this route like the back of his hand. He'd been driving it for 20 years. "Sir, I respectfully disagree," the judge responded, his voice steady as he handed over his driver's license and registration. "I haven't passed a stop sign since turning onto Hampton Street, and I came to a complete stop at that intersection." The atmosphere shifted noticeably when Officer Sullivan's flashlight beam fell on the judge's credentials. His judicial ID was clearly visible alongside his driver's license, but instead of de-escalating the situation, this seemed to agitate the officer further. "Step out of the vehicle," Officer Sullivan ordered, his voice taking on an edge that sent a chill down the judge's spine. Despite the warm evening, the air suddenly felt cold. The judge complied, maintaining his calm exterior while his mind raced through years of legal experience, trying to understand why this stop was going so wrong. "Officer, I want to cooperate fully, but I'd like to understand what's happening here." What happened next would be replayed thousands of times across news channels and social media. Officer Sullivan, who had numerous complaints in his file about racial bias, suddenly grabbed the judge's arm, spinning him around and forcing him against his own car. The judge's cheek pressed against the warm metal of his sedan's roof, the same car he'd driven to countless community events and charity functions. "Stop resisting," the officer shouted, though the judge was standing completely still, his years of judicial composure being tested like never before. The dashboard camera in the patrol car captured everything: the unnecessary force, the judge's quiet dignity, the complete absence of any resistance. Nearby, a young couple walking their dog had stopped, the woman already recording with her phone. Other cars slowed as they passed, their headlights illuminating a scene that would soon spark outrage across the nation: a respected judge, still in his suit and bow tie, being roughly handled by an officer who had clearly crossed a line. The judge's glasses had been knocked askew, and he could feel his tie pressing uncomfortably against his neck. But even in this moment of humiliation and anger, his mind was working, analyzing, understanding. He thought about every young person he'd mentored, every speech he'd given about maintaining composure in the face of injustice. This wasn't just happening to him, it was happening to his entire community. "Officer," he said, his voice still steady despite the pressure on his back, "I am Judge Wilson of the Circuit Court. Your dashboard camera is recording this interaction, and I want to be clear that I am not resisting. I am cooperating fully, but I am also aware that this stop is inappropriate and potentially unlawful." The mention of the dashboard camera seemed to register with Officer Sullivan, but he maintained his aggressive stance. By now, more cars had stopped, more phones were recording, and what had started as a routine drive home had become something much larger. A moment that would eventually lead to unexpected changes in their community. As the officer called for backup, the judge remained silent, his mind already moving beyond the immediate humiliation to the larger question of how this moment could be transformed into something meaningful. He had no way of knowing then that this painful encounter would eventually lead to one of the most remarkable stories of transformation their city had ever seen. By sunrise the next morning, the video had already gone viral. Cell phone footage from bystanders, combined with the police dashboard camera recording, painted a clear picture of what had happened. The images were everywhere: a respected judge, still in his courtroom bow tie, being roughly handled by an officer during what should have been a routine traffic stop. The judge's phone hadn't stopped buzzing since he'd gotten home the previous night. News outlets from across the country were requesting interviews. Civil rights attorneys were offering to take his case pro bono. Social media was exploding with outrage, and local community leaders were calling for immediate action. Sitting in his home office, the judge watched as clips of the incident played on the morning news. His wife brought him a cup of coffee, that hand resting supportively on his shoulder. She knew her husband well enough to see that behind his calm exterior, he was processing not just his own experience, but its larger implications for their community. "They're calling for protests downtown," she said softly, gesturing toward the TV where crowds were already gathering outside the police headquarters. Signs bobbed up and down in the morning light: "Justice for Judge Wilson" and "End Police Bias Now." The scene was peaceful but charged with emotion. The judge's phone rang again. This time it was the police chief. "The mayor wants to meet," the chief said, his voice tense with concern. "Officer Sullivan has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation." The chief paused before adding, "The officer's body camera footage confirms everything. There was no stop sign, no violation. This should never have happened." Throughout the day, the story gained momentum. National news crews set up their equipment outside the courthouse where the judge had worked for 2 decades. His colleagues on the bench issued statements of support, and the state's Judicial Association called for a thorough investigation. Social media was ablaze with discussions. The video had been shared millions of times, sparking heated debates about law enforcement reform. What made this incident particularly powerful was the judge's status. If this could happen to a respected member of the judiciary, people argued, what chance did ordinary citizens have? By afternoon, the crowds downtown had grown larger. Community organizers spoke through megaphones, sharing stories of similar encounters. Young people held up their phones, streaming the gathering to followers across the country. The judge watched it all unfold on his television screen, his expression thoughtful. His grandson called from college, voice shaking with anger. "Grandpa, I saw what happened. We're organizing a student protest here." The judge listened quietly, remembering his own youth, his own anger at injustice. But years on the bench had taught him something about the complexity of human nature and the possibility of transformation. The police union issued a statement, carefully worded to acknowledge the seriousness of the incident while attempting to frame it as an isolated event. But reporters had already uncovered Officer Sullivan's history. 3 previous complaints of racial bias, all quietly resolved without disciplinary action. As evening approached, the judge's doorbell rang constantly. Neighbors brought food and offered support. Community leaders sought his guidance on how to channel the growing public outrage. Everyone wanted to know what action he would take. Would he file a lawsuit? Call for the officer's termination? Lead the growing movement for police reform? In his study, the judge reviewed the footage one more time. He noticed something in Officer Sullivan's face that others might have missed, not just anger, but fear. Fear that had been trained into him, fear that had been reinforced by years of biased assumptions. The judge had seen that same fear in countless cases before his court, and he understood its destructive power. His wife found him there, still watching the footage as night fell. "You've got that look," she said, knowing her husband's contemplative expression. "You're thinking about doing something unexpected, aren't you?" The judge nodded slowly. 20 years on the bench had taught him that the most powerful changes often came from unexpected directions. As the city simmered with tension and news helicopters circled overhead, he began to formulate a response that would surprise everyone, one that would transform this moment of conflict into an opportunity for real change. Looking out his window at the gathering darkness, he could see news vans still parked along his street. The story wasn't going away. But perhaps, he thought, it could become a different kind of story, not just another incident that fueled anger and division, but something that could bridge the deep gaps in their community. First, though, he would need to do something that many would consider controversial. He would need to talk to Officer Sullivan. The judge's decision came as a shock to everyone. 3 days after the incident, as protesters continued to gather downtown and social media buzzed with calls for justice, he walked into the mayor's office with an unusual request. He didn't want Officer Sullivan fired. Instead, he wanted to meet with him face to face. The mayor's office was silent after he made his proposal. The police chief shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The city's legal advisor started listing all the reasons this was a bad idea. But the judge remained firm, his hands clasped calmly on the polished conference table. "Everyone expects me to file a lawsuit," he explained, his voice carrying the same measured tone he used in his courtroom. "They're waiting for me to demand the officer's badge. But what would that accomplish? Another officer fired, more anger on both sides, and nothing really changes. Outside the mayor's window, he could still see protesters with their signs. A news helicopter hovered in the distance. His phone had dozens of missed calls from national media outlets, all wanting to know his next move. Nobody expected this. "What exactly are you proposing?" the mayor asked, leaning forward with interest. The judge laid out his plan. A mediated meeting with Officer Sullivan, followed by a joint effort to create a new type of training program for the police department. The response was immediate and mixed. His closest friends thought he'd lost his mind. "After what he did to you," his best friend exclaimed over the phone that evening, "he should be looking for a new job, not getting a second chance." His wife, though, understood. She'd watched him handle cases for 20 years, seen how he always looked for opportunities to create real change rather than just punishment. "You see something in this situation that others don't," she said as they sat on their porch that evening, watching more news vans park along their street. The police union was suspicious. Officer Sullivan's representatives called it a trap. But the judge persisted, working through channels, making it clear that this wasn't about humiliation or revenge, it was about something much more important. His grandson called again from college, confused and a little angry. "Grandpa, we've been protesting for days. People are finally paying attention to police bias. Why are you letting him off the hook?" The judge smiled at his grandson's passion. "I'm not letting anyone off the hook," he explained. "I'm trying to create a hook that holds everyone accountable for making real change. Sometimes the best way to fight against something is to fight for something better." Civil rights leaders were divided. Some saw it as a weakness, others as wisdom. The judge's inbox filled with messages from both supporters and critics, but he remained steady in his conviction that this was the right path. A week after the incident, he sat in his chambers reviewing Officer Sullivan's personnel file. 3 previous complaints of racial bias, but also commendations for bravery and community service. The picture it painted was complex, a man who wasn't simply good or bad, but human, carrying his own burdens and biases. The judge thought back to cases he presided over, times he'd seen people transform when given the right opportunity. He remembered a young man who'd come before him years ago, angry and defensive, but who'd completely turned his life around when someone finally took the time to look past his actions to see his potential. His decision was causing ripples beyond the city. National news outlets were picking up on this unexpected turn in the story. "Judge chooses dialogue over dismissal," read one headline. "Controversial decision or breakthrough moment?" asked another. The date for the meeting was set. The police chief had arranged for it to happen at a neutral location, a community center where the judge had often spoken to youth groups about the law. The city's diversity coordinator would be there to mediate, along with a respected community leader. The night before the meeting, the judge sat in his study, preparing as carefully as he did for any important case. But this wasn't about legal precedents or judicial rulings. This was about something more fundamental, the possibility that even the deepest wounds could become openings for healing. His wife brought him a cup of tea and sat with him a while. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "whatever happens tomorrow, you're teaching everyone something important. You're showing that there's always another way, if we're brave enough to try it." As he finally headed up to bed, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Officer Sullivan's representative. The officer had agreed to come to the meeting, not just with his union rep, but ready to talk. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The judge lay awake for a while, thinking about the next day. He knew some would see his decision as too soft, others as too idealistic. But decades on the bench had taught him that true justice sometimes required looking past the obvious path to find the one that led to real change. Tomorrow would test that belief in ways he never experienced before. The community center's conference room felt smaller than usual that morning. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the simple wooden table where history was about to be made. The judge arrived early, taking a moment to gather his thoughts in the quiet space. Officer Sullivan arrived exactly on time, flanked by his union representative and looking noticeably uncomfortable in his civilian clothes. The judge noticed how the officer's hands trembled slightly as he set his water bottle on the table. This wasn't the same aggressive man from that night. Here was someone who looked uncertain, perhaps even afraid. The city's diversity coordinator opened the meeting with ground rules, But the judge gently raised his hand. "If it's all right with everyone," he said, "I'd like to start by sharing something." The room fell silent as he removed his familiar bow tie and placed it on the table. "This tie was a gift from my father," he began, his voice steady and clear. "He worked as a janitor in this very building for 30 years. Every morning, he put on his uniform with pride, teaching me that how you present yourself to the world matters. He also taught me about the reality of being a black man in America." The judge noticed Officer Sullivan shift in his seat, but he continued, "The night you pulled me over, I was wearing this tie. I'd worn it to every court session for 20 years. But that tie, my judicial ID, my years of service, none of it mattered in that moment. I want to understand why." What happened next surprised everyone in the room. Officer Sullivan, instead of becoming defensive, dropped his head into his hands. When he looked up, there were tears in his eyes. "I've been trying to understand that myself," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Over the next 2 hours, walls began to crumble. The officer spoke about growing up in a small town where he rarely interacted with people who didn't look like him. He talked about his police training, which focused more on threat assessment than community building. He described the fear that had become a constant companion during his patrols. "But fear isn't an excuse," he admitted, looking directly at the judge for the first time. "When I watched that body cam footage, I didn't recognize myself. Or maybe I did, and that's what scared me the most." The judge listened intently, occasionally asking questions that went deeper than accusations. He shared stories from his own life. Times he'd faced prejudice, moments when preconceptions had nearly derailed his dreams. But he also talked about the people who had helped him overcome those barriers, including white mentors who had challenged their own biases. As the morning wore on, the conversation shifted from past actions to future possibilities. The officer spoke about changes he wanted to see in police training. The judge shared insights from his years on the bench about how community trust could be rebuilt. "I have kids," Officer Sullivan said at one point, his voice breaking slightly. "I want them to grow up in a world where this kind of thing doesn't happen. But I never thought I'd be the one making it happen." The diversity coordinator, who had facilitated hundreds of similar sessions, later remarked that she'd never seen such an honest exchange. The union representative, who had come prepared for confrontation, found himself taking notes about training reforms. As the meeting drew to a close, the judge did something unexpected. He stood up, picked up his bow tie from the table, and walked over to Officer Sullivan. "This tie represents dignity, respect, and service," he said, "values I believe we both share, despite what happened that night. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" The officer stood as well, meeting the judge's gaze. "I want to be part of the solution," he said. "I just don't know how." The judge smiled for the first time that day. "That's why I'm here," he replied. "Because sometimes the best way to create change is to work with the people you least expect." As they prepared to leave, the union representative asked about next steps. The media was still camped outside, waiting to hear what had happened. Protesters were still marching downtown. The world was waiting to see how this story would end. But something had shifted in that room. A conversation that began with tension had evolved into something neither man had expected, a partnership that would soon change their department, their city, and eventually, departments across the country. As they left the community center that day, both men understood that this wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning of a much bigger one. The real work, the hard work of creating lasting change, was about to begin. The news that the judge wasn't pressing charges sent shockwaves through the community. Instead, he announced something unprecedented. A new training program for the police department, with both him and Officer Sullivan at its heart. Some called it naive, others called it revolutionary. Nobody could ignore it. The first training session was held in the same community center where their conversation had taken place. Officers filed in, many looking skeptical, some openly hostile. They'd expected another lecture about bias. Instead, they found both the judge and Officer Sullivan standing together at the front of the room. "I'm not here to shame anyone," the judge began, adjusting his signature bow tie. "I'm here because what happened to me wasn't just about one traffic stop or one officer. It was about patterns we all need to understand." Officer Sullivan stepped forward, his voice shaky at first but growing stronger. "2 weeks ago, I was sitting where you are, thinking I knew everything about being a good police officer. I was wrong. The room fell silent as he described that night, not defending his actions but examining them honestly. The training wasn't just talk. They brought in experts in psychology to explain how unconscious bias works. Community members shared their experiences. Body camera footage from various incidents was analyzed, not to point fingers, but to understand how situations escalate and how they could be handled differently. What made the program unique was its honesty. Officer Sullivan shared his own journey of confronting his biases. "I used to think being called racist was the worst thing that could happen to me," he told each group. "Now I understand that not confronting our biases is much worse." The judge's grandson, still in college, came to observe one session. Afterward, he hugged his grandfather with tears in his eyes. "Now I get it," he said. "This isn't about forgiveness, it's about real change." Word spread about what was happening. Other departments began sending observers. The media, which had initially criticized the judge's decision not to pursue legal action, started running stories about this new approach to police reform. Officer Sullivan found himself becoming a different kind of leader within the department. Young officers began coming to him for advice, not just about procedures, but about their own struggles with bias and fear. "I'm not an expert," he would tell them. "I'm just someone who learned the hard way that we have to be honest about these issues." The program wasn't always smooth sailing. During one session, an officer stormed out, saying it was all political correctness gone too far. The judge and Officer Sullivan used that moment to demonstrate real-time conflict resolution, turning a potential setback into a teaching opportunity. Community trust began to rebuild, slowly but surely. Crime rates didn't spike, as some had warned. Instead, community members began reporting feeling more comfortable approaching officers. Officers reported feeling better equipped to handle tense situations. The judge continued his work on the bench, but now he also spent evenings and weekends helping to refine and expand the program. His wife noticed how energized he seemed despite the long hours. "You're not just handling cases anymore," she observed. "You're preventing them." 6 months into the program, something remarkable happened. During a routine traffic stop, a young officer recognized a situation similar to what had happened with the judge. Instead of escalating, he used the techniques he'd learned. The encounter ended with a warning and a handshake instead of handcuffs. Officer Sullivan kept the body camera footage from that night on his phone. "This is what change looks like," he would say, showing it during training sessions. "This is what happens when we learn to see each other as human beings first." The program wasn't just changing procedures, it was changing hearts and minds. Officers began sharing stories of how they'd applied their training in real situations. Community members reported positive encounters with police that would have gone very differently before. 1 year after that fateful traffic stop, the judge stood before a new group of officers. His bow tie was perfectly straight, just as his father had taught him. But now it represented something new, not just personal dignity, but the possibility of transformation. What happened that night could have ended with anger and division, he told them. Instead, it's ending with understanding and change. But really, it's not ending at all. It's just the beginning of what we can achieve when we choose to learn from our mistakes instead of defending them. The room was packed, not just with local officers, but with visitors from other cities hoping to implement similar programs. Officer Sullivan sat in the front row, nodding as the judge spoke. Both men knew that their work was far from over, but they had proven something powerful, that real change was possible, even in the most unlikely circumstances. 3 years after that unforgettable traffic stop, the judge stood at a podium in Washington, D.C. Behind him sat police chiefs from across the country, all eager to learn about what had become known as the Bridge Program. Beside him stood Officer Sullivan, now a respected trainer who had helped implement the program in 12 different cities. "Change doesn't always come from fighting against something," the judge began, adjusting his familiar bow tie. "Sometimes it comes from building something better together." The audience leaned forward, many taking notes, others nodding in recognition of a truth they'd seen in their own departments. The numbers told a powerful story. In cities that had adopted the program, complaints about racial bias had dropped by 60%. More importantly, community trust scores had risen dramatically. Officers reported feeling better equipped to handle difficult situations, and community members said they felt more comfortable approaching police. But the real story wasn't in the statistics. It was in the countless small moments that added up to real change. Like the time a teenager was caught shoplifting, and instead of immediate arrest, the responding officer took time to learn about the boy's struggles at home. That officer had been through the training program and recognized an opportunity to make a difference rather than just enforce the law. Or the day a traffic stop went viral for a different reason, when an officer and a driver ended up having a thoughtful conversation about community relations, all captured on body camera. The officer later credited her training in the program for giving her the tools to turn a tense moment into a positive interaction. The judge's grandson, now graduated from college, had become one of the program's strongest advocates. He traveled to universities across the country, sharing the story of how his grandfather's choice to seek understanding, rather than vengeance, had created ripples of change that continued to spread. Officer Sullivan's transformation had been particularly profound. From being the subject of multiple bias complaints, he had become a leading voice in police reform. His honest sharing of his own journey helped other officers confront their biases and fears. "I'm not proud of who I was that night," he would tell them, "but I'm proud of who I've become because of it." The program had evolved beyond its original scope. It now included community members as regular participants, creating dialogue between police and the people they served. Local high school students attended modified versions of the training, learning early about the importance of understanding and communication. One day, while reviewing the program's progress, the judge found himself back in the community center where it had all started. The room where he and Officer Sullivan had their first real conversation was now used regularly for training sessions. On the wall hung a simple frame containing his father's words, "Dignity isn't just about how you dress, it's about how you treat others." The media attention had evolved too. Instead of focusing on the initial incident, reporters now came to study the program's success. National news features highlighted departments where the training had made a measurable difference. Other cities began reaching out, wanting to know how they could implement similar changes. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from unexpected places. Like the letter from a retired officer who wrote, "After 30 years on the force, I thought I knew everything. This program taught me I still had a lot to learn." Or the teenager who approached Officer Sullivan after a community session to say, "You made me believe people really can change." The judge's wife noticed something else too, how the program had changed her husband. "You've always been fair on the bench," she told him one evening, "but now you're teaching others how to be fair in their everyday lives." 3 years after that night that could have ended so differently, the judge stood in his chambers, preparing for another day in court. His bow tie was straight, just as his father had taught him, but now it represented something bigger than personal dignity. It had become a symbol of how one moment, handled with wisdom and courage, could transform an entire community. Outside his window, he could see new recruits arriving for their training session. Officer Sullivan would be leading today's class, sharing his story once again. The judge smiled, thinking about how far they'd come from that tense night 3 years ago. As he headed to his courtroom, he passed a wall of photos showing recent graduates of the program. Each face told the story of change, of barriers broken down, of new understanding gained. But more importantly, each represented a step toward the kind of world he'd always believed was possible, one where justice and understanding went hand in hand. The real legacy, he often said in his closing remarks at training sessions, isn't just in changing how officers and communities interact. It's in showing that even our most difficult moments can become opportunities for transformation. We just have to be brave enough to take that first step toward understanding. And in cities across the country, that legacy continued to grow, one conversation, one training session, one changed mind at a time.